Greetings, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm David Hadbawnik. I'm the host. I'm also going to be reading, and Omar Al-Nakib is joining us from Kuwait.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Omar.
Coming in from Kuwait, it's 4 a.m. Just stopping at him, just ready for this. Very excited for this Zoom meeting. And yeah, that's it. Hopefully we'll discuss a lot of art, discuss the book and everything like that. It'll sort of let you into the process and everything. So yeah.
Yeah, again, and there's a lot of people I want to thank. And we're going to have to sort of keep things moving because Zoom is going to cut us off after about 40 minutes. And hopefully, we have a lot to look at, a lot to talk about, and very excited to do all of that. So people I want to thank, first and foremost, Omar. Because when the first 6 books were published in 2015, I literally got the box of author copies a few days before we moved to Kuwait to start working and teaching at American University of Kuwait. And I just barely had time to pop a few in the mail and ship the rest to myself in Kuwait. So I never really had a chance to, I ended up going to London, doing one sort of reading for that. And then a few years later, we had Eliot, and my motivation to continue, when you're working on a poem that's actually 10,000 lines long and you've gotten halfway through, and really books 1 through 6 is where a lot of the exciting stuff happens. They're traveling all over, they're having their Aeneas and Dido, the funeral games, the visit to hell, all of that. Books 7 through 12, you still have 5,000 more lines to go, but it's a lot of war. It's a lot of body count, kill lists. There's literally lists of just people killing other people, which I've included in the translation, and Omar's done a wonderful job illustrating. So I needed some motivation, and I had a few editors who had asked me for parts of the Aeneid, so I kept going, nibbling a little bit at book 7. And then at a certain point, I met Omar. He was still attending AUK at that time, and I quickly realized he was a great artist and also an excellent poet. And at some point, it just hit me, why not ask Omar to take a stab at some illustrations for this book? And he really just took it and ran with it, and got to the point where I could barely keep up. And it really just spurred me to, at some point I was like, wow, I need to keep going with this. Otherwise, kind of letting my partner down here. So otherwise I never would have finished it, quite frankly. I also want to thank Dale Smith, who generously adapted his essay from the Boston Review. And we used that as the introduction. Tony Frazier, the editor and publisher of Shears and Books, who was very patient over the basically 7 or 8 years, first putting together books 1 through 6, and then the 5 more years it took to do books 7 through 12. Of course, Tina Gigan, my wife, who was supporting me throughout, and all the editors who generously published parts of this book all along the way. And there's been a lot of them, too many to name, but I'm really grateful for all of those. So anything to add to that, Omar, before we get started?
Yeah, I wanted to say actually, thank you very much for the kind words. I mean, I approached your work, I mean, less as an illustrator and more just as a fan, you know? Because when I entered your office at AUK and I saw you did a translation of Virgil, I'm like, okay, this seems interesting. And I just took it to a coffee shop right after, read it, and it was just, my mind was blown, you know? It was so beautiful and colloquial, but also radical at the same time. So I just, you know, I felt honored that I was picked by you for that, you know? And so, I mean, when you said like, you know, you couldn't keep up with what I was doing, it's only because I was vomiting out illustrations because I was so inspired by it, you know? And just on a very basic level, I mean, I love bloodlust, and this was an especially bloody sort of section of the book, you know, the ones I was illustrating. And so it was like, to me, I was in heaven pretty much, you know? So yeah, this entire process, which has now been, I think, taken us like 4 or 5 years. I mean, every time we've come back to it, you know, because it's been a bit intermittent sometimes, it's just been, I don't know, a great joy. And I waited for every single installment from you with like bated breath, you know? So like I couldn't, it was like Christmas came early, but like multiple times, you know, every other fortnight, you know? So yeah, that's all I would say. So like, I'm just very honored to be part of this. I'm very glad that, you know, you picked me, because also like, I'm a huge fan of Kerry Kaser's illustrations of, you know, the first few books of this. And so it's like, you know, just to at least be sort of in the same breath as that, of course, not comparable in any way, shape or form, is just lovely. It's just nice, you know? And that's pretty much all I have to just say about that, you know? And yeah.
All right, well, thanks again, Omar. And it's great to see some folks actually up in the middle of the night in Kuwait who are jumping into this. So I'm going to read from a little bit from book 6 here, or 7, I'm sorry. So it really is, book 7 through 12 really are like a totally new poem, because there's a whole cast of characters that we haven't even met in books 1 through 6. One thing that stays constant throughout is Juno, the goddess, wife of Jupiter, who's been pissed off at Aeneas the whole time. She's really driven the action. She's chased him all over the world. And now they've landed in Italy, and the whole book could have ended right here. King Latinus welcomes them in. They form a treaty. Oh, I happen to have this daughter. Why don't you marry her? Students all over the world probably would have been really grateful if the book had just ended right there. But alas, Juno is going to try one more thing here. So she sends a Fury down to muck things up. And the Fury goes and wakes up Turnus, who's another person we're about to meet in this part of the book, in this section of the poem. He ends up being Aeneas's nemesis and rival for the hand of Lavinia. Ascanius is going to be mentioned. That's Aeneas's son, who's Virgil keeps trying to work him into the action. So the Fury is named Alecto. Alecto heads straight for Turnus, and casting off the look of the Fury, puts on the face of an old hag, nudges from sleep the youth. Turnus, she moans, is it all in vain, your throne transcribed to Trojan castaways? What the fuck? Cock blocked by the king, your wedding called off in favor of illegal aliens, and the shitstorm gathers while you sleep. So rise and shine, and if King back on his word doesn't like it, let him taste your steel. Turnus, fuck off, old woman. You think I haven't heard about these cocksuckers flooding the Tiber? Go back to your temple, let the men play at war or peace as they please. More importantly, let me get some sleep. Pissed as hell, the Fury gives up the old lady routine, stands naked and awful before him, eyes wild, hair hissing, tits up in his quavering face. Check me out, motherfucker. Here's what a real woman looks like. His cock goes limp, balls wriggle up into scrotum. Now, what were you saying about men and their guns and how I should go back to my temple? Check me out. I am one of those sisters, the Furies. I hold war, fear, death in my hand. The war is pastoral. Pastoral's the war. Turnus turns on, leaps to arms. Men join him. This one for beauty, that for fame, rousing each other. We'll get laid, boys. They'll sing songs about us, pour oil and honey over our war-scarred backs. The fury flies now to the woods where Ascanius, still seeking that money shot to establish his rep as a hunter, catches sight of a great stag, long-loved pet of Tyrrus, shepherd to royal flocks, the war's pastoral, trained to the touch and knowing the way home. Let's fly an arrow. The bitch goddess makes sure it's the target. They've killed Precious. The cry goes up. Who did? Trojan scum. Alien fuckwads. What are they doing here? The war. Alecto raises a rustic horn, belts out one twisted note that makes mother's milk go cold in their breasts. The rabble grabs sticks, rocks, whatever feels good in the hand, swarm out for blood. Who did it? Pastoral. Nor do the Trojan kids flinch. It's a melee, abandoned camp, telling each other, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. They show up in force, beautiful, sun flashing on spear tips, shields, blades throwing up light like corn waving full in the fields. First boy to go down's named Almo, oldest son of Tyrrus. Bites an arrow that sticks in his gullet and drowns his death cry in blood. War for sure now, and no one can stop it. As bodies pile up, Alecto flies up to heaven and flashes before Juno, boasting, look what I've done. Try and bring them to the peace table now. I'll do more if you want. I'll tempt every neighboring town to step into the quagmire, bog down the whole world in war, scattering limbs in the fields. Enough, Juno says. I'll take it from here. Omar, you want to show some of the...
Oh yeah, let me just share my screen now and just like show the illustrations that I did for this little section right here. So just a second, and the screen should be sharing right now.
Yep.
So this is the first illustration, which is the shitstorm gathers while you sleep. I mean, this is a very literal sort of illustration. That's Turnus, right here. This is done, the illustrations are done usually with pen and ink and then brought into the iPad and then composed there, just played with the compositions. But usually all the black marks and everything like that is just done with Indian ink and pen. And of course, what's around them, of course, because this is a very literal illustration, is a shitstorm, and it's in red because I've restricted the palette of this entire series to just 3 colors pretty much, which is red, cream, and black, of course, with some white like here. But this is the shitstorm because to have it any other color would be just uncouth. And so the next illustration is Alecto raises a rustic horn. So this is it. And of course, the line after this one is belts out an ugly note. And this is the note. I decided to sort of illustrate how I'd imagine the note to sort of come out like in this sort of abstract style. And of course, the red here being a sort of little visual foreshadowing that, of course, what will ensue after this note is belt is just bloodshed, war, death, gore, just really all the good stuff, And then after that, the final illustration for this little section right here is this one, which is the, where is it right here? Yeah, beautiful sun flashing on spear tips, shields, blades, throwing up light like corn waving full in the fields. And this, of course, is the swords. That is, of course, a little sun right there. And, you could take this for either to be a illustration of the metaphor of the, actually the simile, I should say, of the corn, or just the swords just sort of glistening in the air and glinting. And so, so these are the 3 illustrations for this little part right here. And so I'm just gonna stop sharing right now. And yeah, there we go.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
So in this next part, so Aeneas, with the treaty being broken, he has to go off and find some allies to wage this war. And he winds up with this character, King Evander, who's an Etruscan king. And, this part was really Yeah, this part was really interesting. And a big theme of books 7 through 12 ends up being this father and son. So Evander has a son named Pallas, and he kind of entrusts him to the care of Aeneas, and that doesn't turn out so well. Of course, Aeneas has lost his father along the way, and he's got Ascanius with him the whole time. But while he's hanging out with this guy Evander, he tells him this story, and it's really interesting, and they end up bonding over various things, and he kind of initiates him into this ritual. They worship Hercules, and they end up having a party. And I like this part, and I really like the illustrations that Omar did for it. So I'll read a little bit of this. When they're all full and half sit, half lie on the floor, sated and belching, Evander pokes Aeneas in the ribs. Listen, he says, don't get the idea that we're savages here, blindly following old superstitions. There's a method to our madness. Let me bend your ear. I'll explain. First, check out yonder cliff. See how those crags spread along the rock face, seeming to threaten like a bare, broken ruin? Well, there once was a cave where half-human Cacus dwelt in fill-stained darkness, door festooned with sawed-off man faces. Fucking animal. Vulcan had sired him, his the black flame spewing forth as he bore his great frame. One day time brought us a god, gifted in gore, great in spoils, Hercules, who came driving his bulls and settled down by the river. But Cacus, an unstable sort, determined to leave no nefarious stone unturned, stole from Hercules' stable 4 of the loveliest heifers and a like number of top-notch bulls, dragging them by the tails so as to wipe away their tracks and hiding out in his cave. Yet, when Hercules was moving the herd, one of the cattle bellowed, and there came a clamor from the hills, mate crying to mate. Thus Cacus is busted, and Hercules, burning with black fury, snatches up a knotted club and runs to the top of the highest hill. Cacus shows himself, fearful and crazy-eyed, running to trigger a device of his dad's that drops giant rocks, sealing himself up in his hidey hole. Hercules storms after him in a blind rage, feeling desperately over the stones, unable to break through. So, finding a tree that hangs over the river, the oldest and tallest thing around, he tears it out by the roots, smashes it down on the rocks so hard the heavens shake and the river splits and overflows. An environmental disaster, but it works. The cave lies open at last, stripped of shadows, and Hercules unloads on it rocks, trees, anything close to hand, and Cacus, seeing resistance is futile, belches black smoke, fucking gross, and rolls dark mist through the air, choking away sight and turning all into a hellscape of fiery ash. So what does Hercules do? Well, he hurls himself headlong into the thick of the fire. Cacus vomits up more of the void, but the hero's hands find his neck and squeeze until his eyes pop, and his throat spurts blood. Like that, the death fog clears, and plain as day, the oxen Cacus claimed he didn't steal. Now, as he's dragged out by his heels, everyone gets a load of this tough-hearted bastard, his awful eyes and flame-belching mouth. And that's why we have this party every year. In the name of Hercules, who will always be greatest in our book. All you young dudes, why not stick around, let your hair down, and raise your cups to our common God. Gladly join us in toasting him. So Evander speaks. The Hercules tree, the poplar, drapes his face with shadows from multicolored leaves, while the gold cup flashes in his hand, heavy with drink. Happily, they get down to partying, loading the table with all kinds of stuff. It's a kind of party you dream about. And if you're lucky enough to be there, never forget. Leather-clad priests move in the shadows, bearing torches, keeping the plates full, gifts galore, altars smoking, Salai singing of Hercules, how he ripped monsters apart in his hands, the twin snakes sent by his mom, how cities fell in a similar way, Troy and Oechalia, how he toughed out 1,000 labors under Eurystheus, all because of awful Juno. All right, I'll stop there. Omar can show you some stuff.
Yeah, there's one illustration for this one, though I did a bunch, but I just settled on one because they're all, I just felt I needed to sort of convey the disgust of Caucus, I should say. I'm doing the pronunciation all wrong. But instead, the illustrations I did were absolute garbage, but I settled on one that was relatively simple around the thing, where it's this little circular, the things going around it right here, was, I guess, how I interpreted the death fog to be. This is the vomiting. This is Cacus vomiting up the void, And there's Cacus right there, all discombobulated and they're relatively disgusting. And what's interesting actually is that this part is, of course, done by hand, but the rough sort of red lines is all done digitally because for some reason I can't trust myself into actually making a mess and then liking it. So I would just I just spent today just redrawing these circles over and over until they were just the right kind of ugly, just the right kind of stupid, just the right kind of Cacus kind of thing. And so this is what it is. So this is exactly how I guess I envisioned Cacus vomiting a death fog of a void, which would make just an incredible like death metal album, just that, just death fog right there. And so this is the illustration I eventually settled on, just to convey this thing. And and let me stop sharing right now and we can move on.
Awesome. Okay. So the last part I'm going to read from is book 9. So one of the things too about book 7 through 12 is that it's amazing how little Aeneas is actually there for large parts of this because he's off doing these political treaties and rallying folks. And so in book 9, the Trojans are pinned down. Turnus has got them under siege and they're in their camp. And these two characters, Nisus and Euryalus, who we haven't seen since book 5, the funeral games, they're on a foot race, they're good buddies, they're young guys. All of a sudden now, Virgil brings them back, zooms in on these two, and they form this plan to basically bust out of camp and through the Ladins and try to get a message to Aeneas. And there's a pretty strong hint that there's a little more than just friendship going on here. So I played with that a little bit in my translation. All along the walls, the whole army camps out watching, taking shifts, each to his given task. Nisus, their toughest SOB, holds the gate. He's a good man with a spear and light arrows. With him, Euryalus, best looking among the Aniatos, who fills out his uniform like nobody's business. A fresh-faced lad whose cheeks preserve the flower of youth. One love burns between them. In battle, always one right beside the other, and now they man the gates together as sentries. Nisus says, "Do the gods give us this ardor, Euryalus, or is a god made by each man's awful desire? For time out of mind, my heart's nudged me to fight or do something great, and it won't rest until I do. You see how quiet it is out there? The Rutulians lie strewn about, fires flickering here and there, loosened by sleep and wine. Not a soul stirs." You hear what I'm saying? Get where I'm going with this? People in Senate both look to Aeneas, and if they agree to my terms for you, because all I ask is the day's glory, seems to me I can map a path beyond yonder mound straight through to the walls and bulwarks of Pallanteum. Euryalus, struck dumb, gathers himself and speaks. Will you really run off and keep me from joining this adventure? Should I let you go it alone? That's not how my dad, a man's man who trained me to survive the Greek terror in Troy's darkest hour, would want it. And I haven't dragged my ass to hell and back following Aeneas simply to go limp now. Life's a light thing beside the fame you seek. Nisus, I love you. I have no reservations about you, nor about my fate. So Jupiter, whoever's watching, let it rip. But if As you often see in these scenarios, some god or fate snatches me away. I want you to live. You deserve more time on earth. Besides, you can stick around, bury me, perform appropriate rites, and friend, don't let me be the cause of a mother's grief. A mother who dared tag along doesn't give a damn for these walls. Euralius, this is silly. I'm coming with you. Let's go. Together they rush off to seek their leader. So they go to the captains, among them Ascanius. They lay out their plan. Everybody's in tears at how brave they are. And it's true, Euralius has his mother is along on this expedition, and that becomes a big deal. And Ascanius promises to, she's going to be like my mother now, one way or another. So again, this theme of fathers, sons, in this case, mother, sons. So we'll see what happens to them. The two boys step over the trenches and through the shadows into the enemy camp. They'll be the death of many. Everywhere they look, bodies stretched out on the grass, chariots tilted between wheel and harness, arms lying here, empty wine jugs there. Nisus speaks. Euralius, this moment calls for a bold hand. Here we go. You keep watch. Make sure no one moves behind us. I'll deal out death. You follow the trail of blood I leave. Then he turns and stabs proud Ramnes, who's piled up a stack of pillows and lies snoring into the night. A king, actually, and one of Turnus's dearest augurs. Can't augur his way out of this. Next, Nisus runs through three fools snoozing nearby. The arms bearer of Remus and his charioteer. He chops off their heads right at the neck with his blade. Now he beheads their master and leaves his neck belching blood, pillow and dirt both black with it. Lamrus and Lamus, young Serranus, pretty good-looking kid who'd stayed up all late and lies passed out sleeping, happier no doubt if he'd burn up the whole night and play and welcome the dawn. Nisus is mad with bloodlust, gorging on the poor sheep who rest silently about him. Euralius is no slouch either. Feasting on a nameless crowd, Phaedus and Herbesus, Rhoetus and Abaris. Rhoetus is awake after all, but fear makes him hide behind a big bowl. Euralius tiptoes right up close and drives his sword deep through his chest, drawing it back out, dripping death. Rhoetus burps blood mingled with wine and gives up the ghost, dying while Euralius goes about his grim business. He comes upon Messapus's buddies. There he sees the last fires flickering, casting light on tethered horses plucking at grass. Nisus nudges him on the shoulder, sensing they've maybe gone a bit too far, says, enough. Dawn's coming and we've cut a nice path through the enemy. They make their way forward, leaving behind lots of beautiful stuff. Weapons made of solid silver, bowls and beautiful rugs. Meanwhile, the cavalry's come from a nearby Latin town, bearing a message to Turnus, 300 men, all armed for battle, led by Vulcans. They're nearing the camps when they see these guys from a distance, the flash of Euralius's pilfered helmet marking them on the path. Vulcan shouts, halt! Why are you out there? Why armed? Where are you going? No response. The two boys melt into the woods, trusting in the night. The horsemen block all known exits, placing guards at each one. Euralius gets caught first. Dark branches snare the awkward booty and fear trips him up. Nisus gets away. But now, in his foolish flight, he stops and looks back for his missing buddy. Poor Euralius, he says to himself, where did I lose you? Where should I go? Past got me all turned around. He hears horses, shouts, sees the signs of a chase. He's not there long when a scream reaches his ears. Euralius, who's been cheated by the night, being hauled away in the hubbub by a whole bunch of them as he struggles to break free. What should Nisus do? What does he dare do? And with what arms? Or should he just burst into the middle of them and hurry to certain death? So he raises his arm with a sharp spear and addresses the heavens. You, goddess, Latonia's daughter, glory of stars and guard of the woods, be here now to help in this labor. If my dad ever brought gifts from me to your altars, if I've ever done honor to you or hung offerings in your chapel, now let me confuse these guys and guide my missile through thin air. Thus speaking, he puts his whole body into it. The spear twists through night shadows and lands in the back of Solmo, breaking there, and the splintered wood shoots into his gut. He turns and belches death from his breast, long sobs heaving through him. The others look around. Nisus, emboldened, steadies another spear, ready to let fly. While they waver, the spear whistles through Tagus's head right at the temple and hangs there hot in his butchered brain. Vulcan's rages ineffectually, not knowing from which direction the spears are coming or where to throw his anger. You, he sputters, you'll pay for this when I... And he draws his sword and points it at Euryalus. Then, mad with fear, Nisus shouts, unable to hide himself in the dark or abide such horror. Me, I did it. Turn your blades on me, Vertilians. Everything's my fault. He wouldn't have attacked you, nor could he. He just loved his poor buddy too much. Even as he speaks, the sword cuts through Euryalus, crosses the ribs, and bursts through the pink flesh. On the other side, Euryalus torques around in death. Over his lovely limbs, the gore gushes, and his neck slumps on his shoulder, just like when a purple flower is cut down in the field, or when poppies drew pummeled by the odd shower. Nisus explodes into their midst, seeking Vulcans. It's only for him he's hung around. The rest swarm him, waving their swords. He holds fast, nonetheless, twirling his bright blade till he shoves it straight through the gritting face of the Rutulian, and dying, takes his enemy with him. Then he throws himself on his friend, and breathing his last, finds peace, the peace of death. Lucky guys. If my songs are able, no day will ever cross you out from the recollection of eternity, at least not while the house of Aeneas sits on the Capitol's rock and the father of Rome holds sway. That's the end of that passage, and I'll let Omar take over.
Yeah, that particular part, when I remember reading it, I think that's one of my favorite parts of the entire, the Aeneid, because it's like this beautiful little vignette that ends so brutally and so violently and horribly, There's almost, I was reading it with almost like a sadistic pleasure on how, like, you learn to love these two characters so much, and by the end of it, they're literally they're discombobulated. Their entrails are just, splat on the ground, So these are the illustrations I did. Actually speaking, for the earlier section of this, let me just share my screen right now. And just a second. And yeah, like before the story starts, when they're sort of poised, when they're at sentries and they're by the fire. So like this is actually, I think this is Turnus sort of boasting, like, in plain sight, we rile their walls with flames. This is, it's just simply that. This is the wall, and this is the sort of flame, And that's pretty much it for this illustration. This is a very, sort of dry, on the nose kind of illustration right here. And obviously I must have had some kind of fixation with fire when I was illustrating this section, because this one is also another illustration of embers, This is fires burn, guards pass a sleepless night at play. And it's just simply that, But also the way the sort of fire is another case of visual foreshadowing that, of course, things are not well, as they're never well in this story, and that there will be a lot of blood coming up. And so this next illustration is just an illustration of a corpse, pretty much. This one is supposed to illustrate the line. Let me get it out right now. Yeah. What I promise you on your successful return is meant for mother and son alike. Of course, telling, I think, Euryalus that, hey, everything's going to be fine. You're going to be great. You're going to have the spoils of war. The fruits of your labor are going to be rewarded. But of course, really, by the end of it, as David sort of read very beautifully, it does not end well for either of them. And so now moving on to the actual bloodshed. This illustration is Rhodus Burke's blood mingled with wine. This is when they're just, laying waste to the sleeping, soldiers of Turnus. And of course, this is when someone gets stabbed. This particular character was cowardly, and I think was hiding behind the big bowl. And of course, I think he really stabs him from the back. And he, of course, as I so obviously did here, this is the vomit of blood. This is the sort of burst of blood from the stab, mingled with wine, of course, which is why it's so vibrant, And so the next illustration of bloodshed is Euryalus being caught by Vulcan's men and being dragged. And of course, his friend hears the screams. And so this is just literally his body, contorted in pain, ready for death, like a lamb to the slaughter, just being dragged away. And the next illustration is the final one, which is Euryalus' death. Unfortunately, for some reason, I decided to fixate on him and his death. And this is when, I mean, it's so vivid the way you wrote it, David. But I mean, this one is called Euryalus Twerks Around in Death. And how, this is the sword crossing through his ribs, as you could see here, and sort of bursting through the other side. You just see the pink flesh and everything. And that is, I thought, for once in my life, I thought maybe I should be tasteful and just have a little streak of blood right here instead of just overdoing it like a Herschel Gordon Lewis movie, And so these are the illustrations for this section, And these were initially among my favorite to do, because that's when let me turn the video on. Yeah. When I decided to, I felt, at least in terms of my illustrations for this, really sort of doing justice to your translation, So this was the turning point for me just in terms of illustrations. And yeah, that's all I have to say about this. But this particular section, I'm very fond of story-wise. So yeah.
Wow, well, thank you so much. I can't believe we actually managed to do all that in about 30 minutes. I've allowed everyone to unmute themselves. And if anyone has anything they'd like to say or ask, and you could also turn on video if you want. Happy to answer any questions or discuss, or just say hello if you'd like.
Hey, David, that was great. Joe Safdie, it's been a long time.
Yeah, hey, Joe, how's it going?
Pretty great. I was following along with you in a translation that I have. It's by Barry B. Powell. It's okay. It's not great. But, I wondered if you could talk for like a minute or two about your choices in translation, which are obviously so different than the text that I was reading. I mean, you obviously made a conscious decision to strip things down and go, right for the gut. I mean, when did that start for you?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, Joe. It started right from the beginning. In books 1 through 6, I don't even translate, or I didn't publish anyway, the opening, Arma, Wirumque, Cano. I didn't do any of that stuff. I just started in media res with Aeneas about to shipwreck outside of Carthage. And I skipped a lot of stuff here and there. I think when I started 7 through 12, I was reading Christopher Logue's war music. And I think that comes through pretty heavily as an influence, especially in book 7. And then I was reading Peter O'Leary's The Sampo. I was reading Carolyn Bergvall a lot, her medieval trilogy. And I was just trying to come at it in different ways, making different choices to keep things moving and keep things interesting for me, just as a writer, but also hopefully for the reader. And so, yeah, I was, Latin is so incredibly efficient and condensed and compact that I was constantly just trying to shave things down to try to get the spirit of that.
That's great. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else like to say hello or shout at us?
I'll quickly say hello, David. Thanks so much for the reading. I've been waiting for this for the sequel. I really have enjoyed your work with the Aeneid over these many years. You already sort of answered my question. I was going to ask about war music and whether that, like, how much that was sitting in the background. I think I saw a picture of you on Facebook with your son, where I saw that book over your shoulder. But I just wonder about, like, I wonder if you could say a little more about that particular translation of Homer, how much it influences your reading of the sort of Iliad half of, or your translation, I mean, of the Iliad half of the Aeneid, and whether you have anything, like whether you have any new thoughts at this point about the relationship between Homer and Virgil, like after wrestling with the more the more Iliadic, the sort of war part of the Aeneid.
Yeah, well, first of all, Steve, you've been such a great supporter of this work all along, and you're definitely one of the people that I have to thank for supporting it and keeping it going and keeping me going, especially early on. And I know you've been waiting for it, and that was another thing that was like spurring me. It's like, oh man, there are people that are asking me about this. Yeah, the Christopher Logue, in one of the reviews of books 1 through 6, somebody had mentioned Christopher Logue, and I actually hadn't read any of him at that point. And so I grabbed it, and I was blown away, and I actually had to stop reading it at some point because it was just such a heavy influence. And I just had to sort of back away. Otherwise, it just would have taken over the whole thing. But I think the relationship, for sure, I sense Virgil straining to do a sort of Homer-like, muscular, bloody kind of poem here. And I don't think it's his forte, frankly. I think he's much more comfortable with things that's why I had that refrain, the war is pastoral. I feel like Virgil is ultimately a pastoral poet, and he's constantly steering things back to that, however much the poem calls for bloodiness. And I think I was just trying to figure that relationship out as I went along and try to balance things and so on and so forth, if that answers your question at all.
Hi, David.
Hi.
It's Molly. Let me hold on. I'm going to put our video on so we can see you. Wait, maybe not. Okay. Anyway, I wanted to ask a question about translation process.
Oh, I guess I muted everyone's videos, I'm being told.
Oh,
So.
that's okay. It doesn't matter. I was just going to ask, in terms of the translation process, like how that works. Do you do a sort of sentence by sentence translation? Do you put away the original text for a while you're working on it? Like, just how does that work if you're sitting down for an hour to work on it?
Yeah, I did. I would copy out the Latin, usually about 20 lines at a time, into a notebook. And then I would leave a space underneath, and then I would do a really rough translation. And that would take me about half hour, 45 minutes. I would try to do that every morning. And if working steadily like that for about 2 months, you could hack your way through a book and just have the raw translation. But obviously then there was a long way to go from that to something like a poem that anyone would actually want to read or that would make any sense. And along the way, my Latin is pretty good, but I was reading, a bunch of different translations. I mean, I was emailing this morning with Peter Valente, and he mentioned Gowan Douglas, and that for sure was something I always had on my shelf. The Scottish translation from 500 years ago or so. And Ursula Le Guin actually has what she calls a translation. It's just called Lavinia. So it's all the books 7 through 12, purely from the viewpoint of King Latinus' daughter, who is the person everyone's fighting for, fighting over. So I was looking at lots of different things. I was roughing out the Latin myself, and then I was constantly massaging it and playing with it and trying to keep it interesting. if that makes sense.
Hello, hello, David.
Hello, Rosalind.
Hi. Well, good to see you again. Thanks for such a great reading and really excellent translation. This takes me back to my A-level Latin days, rather a long time ago. But I was really impressed by how contemporary you made the whole thing feel, and I think that translation really comes alive. And congratulations again. Also to Omar, who did such a good job with the illustrations.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, well, I thought you did a great job. I said it's 4:45 in the morning here in Kuwait, but I'm glad I got up for it. And yeah, so anyway, congratulations.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. It's well worth getting up at 4, certainly.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to the folks in Kuwait who got up in the middle of the night for that. Yeah, I don't know how I seem to have disabled everyone's video. I'm trying to figure that out right now. I have a question though for Omar, which is, we worked on this for a really long time. How did you feel like the images sort of changed, or did they change, or did your approach change at all?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at the beginning, sort of, I guess halfway through, as I said, around book 9, suddenly that's when I felt that the illustrations were sort of, I think, approaching being worthy of the translation itself, because whereas before, like, what I thought was passable was not whatsoever. But suddenly, as I started going on and the use of red was starting to become more prominent, it was like day and night, And so what I did towards, as I was telling you before, towards the end of the book, is I went and redid all of the previous illustrations just because I felt like they weren't up to snuff. Because over the course of 5 years, I guess the person I was in the beginning of this entire thing is nowhere near the person I am now. And thank God for that, So it was just really, in a weird way, this entire thing was a learning process. It was like learning on the job, And so to have a work that I feel does like maybe elevate you, it certainly pushed me as an artist to sort of just like, sort of countless nights of like, all right, this illustration, it's like, maybe I'm hiding too much behind the sort of Russian constructivist, Italian futurist kind of thing, and sort of, I wanted to create this house style just for the Aeneid, and I think towards the end of the book, I think I might have achieved that, if I dare say so. Of course, it could have, I have no perspective whatsoever, but I do feel like by the end of it, it was a style that is very particular to this work and this work alone. And just it was certainly a huge thing. But I remember being mortified, sort of going over all the early illustrations I did and just feeling like, that was old Omar, and thank God he's dead and buried right now, So that's it, the beginning and the end, just completely different. But learned a lot too. It was excellent. Learned how to use the iPad and incorporate it into the art too, which is a whole other ballgame, So yeah.
Great. Okay. Oh, there's your video. I think everyone should be
there
able
we
to do
go.
video now.
Yeah, finally. Wait, let me.
So sorry for that.
No, it's good to be back visually,
Well, Zoom generously allowed us to stick around a little while longer, and I appreciate you all sticking around. If anyone else wants to say hello, do it now. Otherwise, I think I'll try to wrap things up here.
Or forever hold your peace.
Or forever hold your peace.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for taking your time out on a Saturday. We really appreciate it, or Sunday, as the case may be, in Kuwait.
Yep.
Mashallah, thank you so much. And thanks, Omar.
Oh, my pleasure. My absolute pleasure. So, yeah, gonna have a lovely sleep after this, let me tell you. So,
All right.
So yeah. And thanks everyone for the kind words. Truly, it means the absolute